This week on the agenda, de-dollarization. Is the conflict in Iran leading markets to reconsider the role of the US currency in the global economy? Markets are reacting in real time to conflict, tariffs and political risk. Tensions in the Middle East, volatile energy prices and growing trade friction all put the global economy under serious pressure. So what does that mean for the dollar's role at the centre of the system? Is de-dollarization now an option like never before? With me now are Paulo Nogueira Batista, economist and one of the founding members of the new development bank established by BRICS in Shanghai. Jane Foley, head of FX at Rabobank and political economist and Pettifor. What a panel. Great to have all of you on the agenda. Paulo, let me start with you, because the global economy is on edge. I mean, is this the moment that the dollar system really starts to come under pressure?
Well, I would say that the dollar system has been under pressure for some time now, basically for two reasons. The fragilities, fiscal, financial, of the US economy, and also because of the way the US is using the dollar. For a long time now, the US has been accustomed to using the dollar and the Western financial system to punish sanctioned countries they think are not behaving. And this has led to a growing mistrust in the dollar. I would say that the dollar has one important enemy, and that enemy is the US itself. Now, the dollar is still the main currency, and there's a lot of inertia in monetary and financial arrangements. But with Donald Trump and with the wars he's starting together with Israel, the situation has changed, I believe, in the direction of de-dollarization. And I would go even further. I would say that if a financial crash comes to pass in the United States, as many analysts and economists predict, probably the traditional safe haven, traditional and paradoxical safe haven role of the dollar. For example, in 2008, the crisis originated in the US financial system, 2008, 2009. Nevertheless, in times of acute uncertainty, investors fled to the dollar. I don't think this will hold anymore if a new major financial crisis erupts in the United States. So you have a volatile, aggressive, unstable government, the Trump administration, together with some pre-existing fragilities that may become worse if a new crisis erupts. So the dollar is coming under pressure, more pressure than before.
Some really interesting points that I know we're going to pick up with our panellists as we go through this. But Jane, I wanted to talk to you about oil prices, because they have been swinging wildly on headlines around the Iran war, about shipping risk and political signalling. What does that volatility tell us about global stability in the financial system?
Well, it tells us many things. I mean, first of all, it tells us, obviously, about the Strait of Hormuz and its closure. It tells us that there is a difference between the futures market in oil, for instance, and the physical market, because the futures market is clearly quite optimistic that this war will come to an end quite soon, whereas the physical market really does show those strains. And, of course, those strains are real, and they will have a real impact on the global economy, both in terms of inflation and then in turn demand destruction too. But it tells us something else, and perhaps it tells us something about the next chapter in the discussion about de-dollarization, because we've been talking about de-dollarization for many years. Last year, again, a lot of times de-dollarization came into the conversation, and that was, of course, to do with the politicization of the dollar through the Trump administration. But it does seem that right now, because of the closure of the Strait, maybe because of Saudi's relationship with the US, that this war could be the next chapter in that discussion about de-dollarization. Are there more deals being done between Iran and maybe even Saudi with China to denominate those oil sales in renminbi? Are they going to be less in dollar, for instance? And also we can put in perhaps the latest news, and that is the UAE deciding to remove itself from OPEC. Is that a win for the US, a win for the dollar? But it will take a while before we can really evaluate this chapter properly, but for now it does appear that this is an interesting chapter.
And when we look at things like tariffs, like sanctions, export controls linked to Ukraine and the Middle East, are those isolated tools and levers that can get pulled, or signs of a more fragmented global economy?
I think on the one hand, it is a sign of of fragmentation, but it is also the fact that the United States is still the only superpower and is behaving in very contradictory ways. So on the one hand, the administration, the Trump administration, has very deliberately sought to weaken the dollar and also to weaponize its choke points, if you like, in order to impose sanctions on other states, as it did after the Russia invasion and on many occasions. But the point is, what the United States is doing now is desanctioning. So it's removing sanctions from Russia, removing sanctions from Iran. So it's really interesting that it's beginning to use that power in a very different way. So, I mean, I think, there is fragmentation, but the United States, and there is also no doubt in my mind that central banks are selling their treasuries, and that actually they've been net sellers of treasuries for some weeks now, mainly because countries like India and Thailand have to garner resources to deal with this $100 oil price, and they need dollars for that. So they are selling treasuries. Yeah. But the dollar is still stronger, and I think it will still be a safe haven for some time to come.
So US treasuries are being sold. Countries need the dollar to deal with all of these rising prices, particularly in energy markets. I mean, Paulo, is there then any clear evidence of this shift away from the dollar in global trade, in finance?
There is considerable evidence. For example, to take an extreme case, transactions between China and Russia are now nearly 100% denominated in rubles and renminbi. A country like Brazil transacts about 40% of its trade with China in reais and renminbi. The share of the dollar in reserves, as reported by the IMF, has fallen to less than 60%. And it's even lower if you consider also gold reserves, because the usual statistics of the IMF do not include gold as part of the set of data. So the US is still the major currency, that's correct, as Anne pointed out. And it still will continue to be a major currency, even if a major financial crisis erupts in the United States. But of course, going lower and lower as time goes by. You see, the main problem is not even economic. I would say it's a political one. No one trusts the US anymore, not even its allies. No one, not the Europeans, not the Gulf state countries, not the emerging market countries, of course not China, and even less Russia. So trust is gone, so uncertainty prevails. Even if, as Anne has just said, we should note an important fact that there is some desanctioning in the case of Russia and others, this won't remove uncertainty. Who knows what's going to be happening next? Sanctions will come back at the whim of the United States government. So I believe that there is clear evidence that the United States, while still being the major currency, is on a declining path.
Yeah. Jane, we're talking about that erosion of trust in the United States, and yet So many things are in US dollars. I mean, oil invoices, it's so embedded in the financial system, it's going to take a long time and a huge political will to even begin to unpick. We're even seeing there's increased interest from central banks in their demand for gold. So what's driving the shift, do you think, in reserve behaviour? Is it that distrust from the US? Is it something else?
I think there certainly has been distrust, particularly in this administration. Whether or not that will continue into the next administration, well, we'll have to wait and see. But I do think it is worth underlining that this shift away from the dollar has been extremely slow. So, for instance, if we go back to the reserves, yes, it's true, over the last 25 years or so, the amount of dollar reserves in central banks has shrunk. But actually, if we take a step back, in that period of time, the amount of US trade as a percentage of global trade has shrunk by a greater proportion. And that's because, of course, because of the development of emerging markets such as China. And you could therefore argue that, isn't it remarkable that the US dollar in reserves hasn't fallen by a greater amount? Now, of course, there is a loose correlation between reserves and the invoices that currency trades in. And as you've just pointed out, US invoices are used all over the world, or US dollar invoices are used all over the world. Now, if we look at data such as trade finance, for instance, yes, we do see in recent years more trade finance being printed in renminbi. But it's still around 6 or 7%. The amount of trade finance in euros still only around 6 or 7%. And the US dollar is virtually all of the rest. So we have this still dominance of US dollar. And even if you like the idea of de-dollarization because of maybe distrust of the current administration in the US, what's the alternative? And I think this is a really important question. And there's also another different aspect to this. If we consider stable coins, for instance, and if we consider the spread of stable coins, dollar-denominated stable coins in, say, Africa or Latin America or South America, actually in those regions, you might be instead talking about dollarization. So there are lots of different aspects to this.
But we also are talking about political will and maybe signals coming from there. I mean, Anne, I'm thinking about France moving billions of its gold reserves from US vaults back home. I mean, what do you think that signals about control, about security of reserves?
Well, it does signal a lack of confidence in the US administration, and France has got form on this. In 1971, President Pompidou sent ships across to repatriate gold from the United States after the Nixon shock. And, we talk about the Trump shock, but actually, in my view, the Nixon shock was far more profound, even though it's not regarded as such by many economists. So, yes, France has got form in this respect. But the point is this, that there are alternatives. And I just want to say to Jane that actually, I'm an advocate of a clearing union. I'm an advocate of low-income countries joining together to set up clearing unions, particularly in Africa. And I've been arguing for some time, together with the Carnegie Foundation, that actually Africa should form a clearing union and trade amongst themselves using their own currencies and using Keynes's idea of a clearing union. There are alternatives. I think the fact that we believe there is no alternative, the dollar, is mistaken. And the fact, the strength of the dollar and the way in which it is weaponized by the United States resembles the way in which Britain weaponized sterling as well. I'm thinking of the Battle of Gallipoli, and where Britain, began to face the reality of her weakening, but not before she'd done a fair amount of harm. So the point is that there are alternatives, and it is for the countries in the BRICS countries now to come up with that alternative and to argue for it. Latin America, I think, Paulo, is more difficult. Africa has a sort of cohesion. There's an African Union. There are venues in which African countries can come together and think about cooperation. I don't believe that's the case in Latin America. But even so, given that Brazil has played such a progressive role in the BRICS community, I do think the Brazilians could be arguing as well for a clearing union.
Paulo, we're hearing there about Africa, about Latin America. Is the rise of big Eastern economies, and indeed the global South, suggesting a move away from the dollar?
Yes, I think so. I agree with Anne that there are alternatives to the dollar. They're not easy to come by. But I think the BRICS are aware of the challenge. Just one point about the BRICS and about Latin America in response to Anne's observations. I know the BRICS quite well. I was part of the initial phase of the BRICS back in 2008, and I continued involved in that process until 2017 in Shanghai. And then when I came back to Brazil, I continued to follow BRICS issues. And I think we should be realistic about BRICS. Yes, they are important. Yes, they are a challenge, but they lack cohesion. So if you look at the track record, unfortunately, of our track record in terms of initiatives, we have been very weak as a group, I would say. China has been very strong as a country, also Russia. But the cohesion of the BRICS is not sufficient to put forward joint initiatives. And Anna's right about Latin America. I mean, Latin America is very heterogeneous. Right now, if you look at the region, you only have a few countries: Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Nicaragua, Cuba, that are, let's say, independent of the American power system, or relatively independent of the American power system, or seek independence from it. But the rest is aligned with the U.S. So I never counted on Latin America joint initiatives. I have more hope still in the BRICS as a process.
Jane, how is China evolving as an alternative to the dollar system? And what are the limits on that, do you think?
Well, I think the easiest thing is to identify the incentives as to why China would want to invoice in renminbi, etc. I think that's very plain to see. So moving away from the dollar system is a clear incentive. They have made some progress in that direction. Clearly, incentives also exist for many other countries, and I would include the EU in that, certainly during this current administration too. And there are lots of examples of more trade being denominated in renminbi, and we've seen that a month ago with the Wall Street Journal reporting that more oil is now being sold by Saudi Arabia to China in renminbi. So there is evidence, and we see this through also China's program to invest in countries such as Africa, to invest in resources, for instance. But if we stand back and we look at the global statistics that we have from, for instance, the Bank of International Settlements, we still have the US dollar printing on almost 95% of all trades. And that's why the dollar, still remains hugely dominant. So yes, there is progress. Yes, there are incentives. But in terms of global trade, the amount of any emerging market country, including China, the mark that they're making in the global foreign exchange system is still relatively small.
And what do you think? For emerging economies, how difficult is it to reduce that dollar dependence without losing access to things that Jane's been talking about, global capital, liquidity, and so forth?
Well, I think it's a major problem for low-income countries. Jane's absolutely right. The dollar is overwhelmingly dominant, and there's two reasons for that. For the start, many low-income countries just do not have the institutions necessary to maintain their own monetary systems and to uphold their monetary systems. I think about countries in Africa which really lack the institution of central bank, of tax collection, of criminal justice systems for enforcing contracts and so on, and therefore they really cannot rely entirely on their own currencies. They also are, because of the export orientation of so many economies, there is a dependence on exports. So all of that has to change if we're going to see some change in the dominance of the dollar. But the point I think that we need to worry about at the moment is that, number one, the Trump administration is deliberately determined to weaken the dollar because they believe this is what has made the United States uncompetitive. And that is to an extent true. But at the same time, they're not willing to do anything about Wall Street, for example, where so much, where treasuries are bought and sold, where the transactions that you know, when China makes money in the United States, it doesn't repatriate that home. On the whole, it tends to invest it back into treasuries and the dollar, and they're trying to stop that happening, and that may stop happening. The point is this: the United States itself is deeply unbalanced at the moment, and in particular in financial terms. We all know, and we're all talking about how much of a bubble AI is at the moment. Not so much the technology, but the financial, the financing of the economics of AI. Yeah. And I think, I'm wondering whether or not the United States can manage yet another financial crisis on a grand scale, because it's clear that that bubble has to burst. It's clear that too much money has been lent. It's clear that too many banks have been lending crazy money, investing crazy money into AI, and are going to make losses. And when the minute they begin to be aware of that. Now, the question is, how much of an impact would such a financial crisis have on the dollar and on the American economy? And would it deepen political tensions? Because for me, we always have to consider the power dynamics in these things, because with this power of the dollar, you get greater political tension in between states, and that leads to, as we see, conflicts. And those conflicts can spread. And the war in Iran, in my view, is currently being internationalized. And you know, so if that were to be accompanied by a financial crisis in the United States, then I think we're in a different territory. We're talking about the dollar in a different way.
We are talking about the dollar in a different way. And Paulo, if we put those the political dynamics aside, and we think about when that bubble is going to burst and that the global economic system becomes so much more fragmented, which economies do you think are best positioned to adapt, and which are most exposed?
Well, those that are better placed to adapt are those that have become, over the years, less dependent on foreign resources, on foreign markets, on foreign capital, on foreign technology. Those that have sought some measure of self-sufficiency will be stronger. For example, countries like Argentina have become very exposed because they went to very much down the line of dependence on foreign resources. But countries like China and to a much lesser extent Brazil have better ways of responding to fragmentation than, and the other losers are mainly those countries that used to benefit from the system. The United States and Europe constructed the post-war, the post-Second World War order from which they benefited. And also if the fragmentation will hurt their interests inevitably. Now let me just briefly, if I can, come back to a few other points that were made by you, moderator, and also by Jane and Anne. You see, about gold. Why did France transfer its resources from the United States to France? Because gold is only a safe asset if it is warehoused at home. That's a very important point. Gold sitting in the vaults of the Federal Reserve or in the Bank of England are vulnerable to seizure, as we have seen in the case of Venezuela. So when the law of piracy prevails, countries need to protect themselves. And about the Trump administration, if I may just briefly, Jane, I have a slightly different view. You see, I don't think Trump is a phenomenon that expresses what's going on more deeply in the United States. So I don't believe that a change in administration will change fundamentally the way the United States behaves. Maybe the sort of extravagant rhetoric and crazy moves will diminish, but the fundamental attitude of the United States, a decaying imperial power, willing to do many violences to delay that decay, will continue. And we, other countries of the world, even the Europeans, are now fully aware of that, I believe.
Taking all of that into account, and Jane, what you were saying about how the renminbi and European currency, the euro, is a much smaller percentage than way behind the big chunk of the financial system that the dollar dominates. Are we moving towards maybe competing financial blocks? I mean, over what kind of time frame would that be? Or do you think it's going to be a more flexible system where countries operate across multiple currencies and financial centres?
I think some will come out on top. I think we will have multiple, but I think within that multiple, it will probably be the euro and the renminbi. I don't think there is much competition or much ability of any other currency to really make much progress into becoming more dominant. But this is a very, very slow process. We did have the Europeans attempt to gauge a little bit more independence in the first Trump administration after the US pulled out of the Iranian nuclear accord, but it didn't really stretch very far. It's very difficult. There will be pushback from the US Treasury too. And we can see now, as I was saying, the incentives for these regions, for these countries to move forward with more independence in terms of their currencies, but also I think technology too. There's certainly a suspicion in Europe too about too much reliance on US technology and US cloud systems, etc., just as there is on US payment systems as well. So there is the push for more independence without doubt, but the ability to get from A to B is going to be very tough and very time consuming, and it really will not be an easy thing to do. And we can look back over the last 25 years and look at the de-dollarization, look at the amount of reserves in dollars that have fallen, but it's not a huge amount, and I think the progress in terms of de-dollarization will continue to be quite slow.
It sounds like what everyone is saying, that the dollar system is changing, but more so coming under a lot of pressure. I mean, Anne, do you agree with Jane's assessment in terms of where the dollar's headed?
We're having a conversation that we did not have 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So there's definitely there a big change in the air. But my fear is that it will remain, I think Jane's right, that it will remain dominant for much longer unless there is some catastrophic event. And I fear that global tensions are such that we must be prepared to think about that, because that could change everything, as it did for Britain when sterling was the world's reserve currency. A second world war made it difficult and impossible for Britain to maintain its role. And I fear that actually, this may carry on in this way in which the dollar remains dominant until we get a moment of crisis. And I don't want us to be moving towards that, because precisely because it would be catastrophic and so harmful.
Anne Pettifor, Jane Foley, Paulo Nogueira Batista, thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok.
Coming up on a future agenda, travel turbulence, how the conflict in Iran is set to change the face of global tourism. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.